Remember when libraries were all about peace and quiet? Well, those days are overdue. From Florida to Texas, the book ban war is on, and we're breaking it down. Hey there, bookworms, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, where we dissect the latest legislation and its real-world consequences faster than you can say speed reading. Today, we're talking about, drumroll please, libraries. No, not the quiet, shushing type. We're talking about libraries that are anything but by the book. Apparently, the war on literature is getting real, and it's a real spine tingler. Stephen, are you ready for the card catalog of this controversy?
Oh, I'm always ready where book banning and political drama collide. It's like the plot of a really weird novel, except, less fun to actually read about. So let's leave no page unturned as we uncover this chapter in American politics.
Are we done with our terrible library puns now?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Let's just turn the page on that, bookmark the conversation, and move on. I really am done now. I've got it out of my system.
Okay. Before we get into this, can we talk about what books we liked reading growing up that maybe wouldn't fly today?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, so I was a complete bookworm growing up. That was all I did really as a kid. I read. I spent all my time in libraries, just walking around with armfuls of different types of books. But I was really brought up on a series of books by an author called Enid Blyton. Now, I'm not sure you get Enid Blyton in America. Is that a name that's familiar? No. So anyone in England would know what you mean by Enid Blyton. It was a writer. She was writing in the 50s and 60s, and she wrote kids books. So at a time when authors basically didn't write kids books back then, she was the only one who did. So it was basically the only books that you could read. My mom was obsessed. She read them to me, and so I read them sort of as soon as I started reading, really very young. Now, the problem with Enid Blyton, though, is she is staggeringly racist.
Oh,
Even for the time, she was super racist. So in the 50s, her publisher refused to publish one of her books because it was too racist. And
oh
this was
my
in the
gosh.
50s, right? So
Wow.
you can imagine by the 70s when I was reading her books, it was quite problematic. And these days, of course, they're still out there, but they're even more problematic. And so it raises that really interesting question of, even though they are fantastically written books and great and engaging, they're obviously hugely dated now, which is a
Yeah.
problem, but also the content. So should you not let kids read them, or should you edit them as they have done with some of her books, and has happened like Roald Dahl as well, had his books edited and thing to make them a bit more acceptable in these days? Or is that, are they sacrosanct? Should you just put them out there and let people read them if they want to? I mean, it's a tough question.
That is a very interesting thing. I was actually going to talk about Roald Dahl because I was obsessed with
Yeah.
him when I was growing up. I think
Mm,
I read every single one of his books 5 times. And it was funny because, I know that there's like a ton of issues with Harry Potter these days, even the school's trying to ban them, which we can kind of get into later. But I
mm,
was never that big into Harry Potter because I got such bad
mm.
nightmares. I tried to read the first one and I just had a really overactive imagination
Oh
when I
dear.
was little and I couldn't get
Wow.
through the first one. And I was like 10. Like I was way too old, but like I would just
Ah,
get such
that's
bad
true.
nightmares.
I read them as an adult, so yeah,
Yeah.
that's I suppose
I
it's
read
slightly
them during
different.
the pandemic. It was like my goal of the pandemic was to read all of the Harry Potters and I got through them
Mm.
and I was so proud of myself. No nightmares. I loved Roald Dahl and I would read him or like Nancy Drew books and I also was quite the little
Mm.
bookworm.
Harry Potter's another really interesting example there, because not only do some people disagree with the content and think, oh,
Hmm.
it's witchcraft, it's Satanism or whatever,
Yeah.
but also, of course, the author is very controversial.
Yes.
And if you disagree with her views on, say, transgender and feminism and so on, does that mean that you shouldn't read the books, or you shouldn't let your kids read the books, or should those two things be separate? Again,
Right.
it's a tricky question.
Well, and it's also interesting with the Harry Potter of it all. I have so many friends that are, working in politics, working to really move progressive agendas forward, and they're very staunch progressives. And Harry Potter is such a safe, good space for them from when they were little, and they were like huge Harry Potter kids. And it is funny because,
Mm,
when you look at the Muggles and the Mudbloods and all of those kinds of things, and there there is
Yeah.
definitely some tonality of things that if you're a little kid, you're not necessarily super understanding that maybe that might be racism or like, some kind
Yeah.
of something like that. I think Harry Potter and the book that you read are really good examples of these books that were exciting places for kids to be and, Roald Dahl when they were little. And then, as we've gotten older, maybe we've appreciated that there might be a little bit more there. But like as kids, we were in the magical spaces that they were creating.
Absolutely. I mean, luckily these days there's an enormous amount of kids' books that are published every year. So if you do want to say, okay, let's not read this old stuff because it's out of date now, well, there's a whole raft of new stuff that will
Right.
match whatever your particular political persuasions are. So it's a little bit easier, I think, than it used to be.
I think let's get into the meat of the bill now.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, here's the scoop. Florida started something big in 2022 when Governor DeSantis signed a bill allowing parents to challenge school and public library books across the state. And since then, we've seen a tidal wave of legislation that targets libraries and their collections. And some say that this censorship, others say that it's protecting kids. But who's right?
Well, it depends on who you ask, doesn't it? If you talk to groups like Moms for Liberty, it's a very big, prominent conservative group, they'll say that they're shielding children from harmful content. But if you ask the American Library Association, which is obviously the organization that represents librarians, trains librarians, and so on, a huge 100-year-old organization, or in fact most librarians, they will just call it censorship, plain and simple. So it's a real tug of war between these two ideas that should you be shielding and protecting children from harmful content, but can you do that without actually falling into that trap of censorship?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen bills like Florida House Bill 1467, Texas's House Bill 900, Utah's House Bill 29, each trying to restrict or remove books from libraries statewide. And it's not just about keeping the kids safe, right? It's about this whole debate over what counts as inappropriate content, what should children be shielded from, and who decides what, that moral authority is there.
Absolutely. And it's a really important question right now because these things are on the rise. Over the past few years, there's been an explosion of book bans. And again, the ALA publishes all sorts of statistics on this, as do other organizations, about the number of books being challenged is rising exponentially, and the number of books actually being taken off shelves is also rising. So a good example of this is Texas's HB 900. And this one puts the responsibility on book vendors to actually rate books by their sexual content, which is obviously very, very subjective. And so what's inappropriate or sort of strong sexual content to one person, it could be completely different for somebody else with a different perspective. And obviously the book vendors there get judged on their ratings. And if they're judged to be rating books wrongly, then they can lose contracts or get into trouble with the law and so on. So it's sort of extremely controversial bill.
I just transported myself to the Scholastic Book Fair, and I'm not sure if you guys had those at your schools, but we had those, and it was like Christmas for the bookworms. And I'm just thinking of being a kid and going in there with my money that my mom gave me to buy books and having to see the sexual ratings. And my mom, you could only have a B plus, no A's, like, or whatever that is. All right. But, nothing says let's foster critical thinking like banning entire sections of a library. And, who needs 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale when you've got, well, nothing left.
Well, yeah, but at least they're being consistent. So they are books about dystopias, and so it sometimes feel like the drives to ban books across the United States is actually about building a dystopia. And obviously, some people will portray it in that way, as though these are sort of terrible restrictions on the way people think and the way they express themselves. Of course, on the other side, as we've said, that's not what they think. They think this is purely around protecting children.
So let's break this down. Proponents say these laws are doing what they need to do to protect kids, especially from content that they deem that is explicit or controversial. But what's the counter argument here?
Well, so the American Library Association will say that it's not about protecting kids. It's about ensuring access to a variety of different perspectives. So what's offensive to one parent is fine for another. Parents have different views, and obviously children are very different as well. So they feel quite strongly that libraries, and in particular politicians, shouldn't be policing that and
Yeah.
imposing viewpoints on everybody.
Hmm.
And I mean, another important point is that children develop their reading skills at different speeds. I mean, I was a very precocious reader, and at quite a young age, I was really bored with children's books, and I started to read adults' books,
Hmm.
which meant that I did come across stuff that I probably shouldn't have been coming across at that age. Hopefully, I don't feel particularly scarred by it, but you do. If you start reading books that aren't written for kids, that are written for adults, you will come across content. So, would you want to stop kids doing that? Because surely the most important thing, particularly in this screen obsessed age, is that people are reading books. You know, that kids are reading
Right.
books. That's the drive. Anybody with kids knows how difficult it can be to get them to pick up a book and put down their phone. So the last thing you want to do is actually stop them reading.
Right. I'm thinking about young adult books, and I'm reading one right now that's kind of a young adult fantasy, and it's about dragons, and like there's some steamy scenes in there. And, it's like, do we require the kids to read a book about the birds and the bees before they get to this level? And then you get into all of those questions about, sex education and how that's taught and all of that. So it's definitely something that you can see a snowballing very quickly.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Moms for Liberty would say, well, none of the above.
Hmm.
No books about the birds and the bees, no books with
Right.
steamy scenes at all.
Right.
That
Right.
just is not appropriate for kids, though I'm not quite sure at what age they would consider it to be appropriate.
Right. And, it's kind of like if you don't want your kid to read it, just don't check it out. But you shouldn't be able to decide that for everyone else, right?
Exactly. So, I spoke to Michael Dowling from the ALA, and he was quite clear that libraries try not to sort of police children in particular, that they
Mm.
consider that's up to the parents. So if you don't want your kids checking out a particular book, then you should be monitoring what they check out, and not letting them do that. That it's not the job of the libraries to do that, and that libraries shouldn't have to remove all of the books that you don't like on the off chance that your child will actually check it out, really. But he also pointed out that this isn't a new issue, and I think it's important to look at the historical context here. So ever since libraries have existed, people have been complaining about the books that they stock. So you might remember when Huckleberry Finn was banned for coarse language, and of course for being a little bit racist. Or we've already spoken about Harry Potter, but at the time, you remember there was a massive freak out about how Harry Potter was promoting witchcraft. And that was a huge issue. Loads of people saying that they weren't going to let their kids read the books.
I did think that Harry Potter was the gateway to dark magic. Next thing you know, these kids were riding around broomsticks in school on their heelys.
Absolutely, and then challenging their English teachers to magical duels and so on. I mean, it's chaos. It's chaos back then.
But seriously, I think that we're seeing this pattern of certain books, especially ones that deal with gender, identity, race, these things that are at the top of the mind for people getting challenged. And these are getting challenged more than others. And I think that the ALA said that almost half of all targeted books in 2023 were about LGBTQIA plus or people of color experiences. And what do you think that's all about?
Well, yeah, this gets to the heart of the objections the ALA in particular have here. They say that the actual attempts to remove books from libraries are less about protecting children; they're more about protecting children from exposure to different types of lifestyles and so on that you consider that's unacceptable. And the sort of focusing this on sexual content is a bit of a Trojan horse, actually. That it is about, I don't want my kids reading books about LGBTQ issues or people of color and so on, or alternative views of the history of the country. And this is, of course, a reflection of a much broader societal tension, really. So particularly at the moment, we're in a particularly politically charged moment where anything that challenges the status quo is seen as threatening.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these laws are about controlling these narratives. So who gets to be seen and whose story is allowed to be told. Now,
Yeah.
the ALA, of course, their whole mission is based on intellectual freedom. They argue that public institutions like libraries should reflect the diversity of society, gender, race,
Mm-hmm.
sexuality, and so on. And that, again, parents have the right to guide their kids reading. So if you don't want your
Yeah.
kids reading this stuff, that's fine. You can stop them doing so. But you absolutely cannot dictate what others can access and what others can read.
Yeah, and I mean, this gets us back to the First Amendment territory because let's face it, when you start pulling books off the shelves, aren't you kind of saying that you don't like their message, and then where do you stop?
Exactly. I mean, again, one of the things that makes America unusual than other Western sort of democracies and so on is this sort of very, very strong belief in freedom of expression, freedom of speech, which is enshrined in the Constitution. And so, if you're removing a book, then theoretically you could be coming into conflict with that. So there is, though, a well-worn obscenity test, which is known as the Miller test, and it was a Supreme Court test that they applied some time ago. And for a book to be considered obscene, they have to meet some very, very strict criteria around sort of the gratuitous nature of the sexual contents and so on.
Mm.
And if they are then deemed to be legally obscene, then they're not covered by First Amendment free speech protections. But it is quite a high bar that's set there, because just because a book that makes you uncomfortable, or you don't like it, or you disagree with the content, that does not mean that it's obscene. And the
Yeah.
courts have ruled on this time and time again.
Yeah, like with Genderqueer a Memoir, which is one of the most challenged books in all of the US. But in Virginia, the judge said that banning it under this obscenity law would be unconstitutional.
Absolutely, because even though it had strong sexual content, it wasn't obscene. So if something is obscene, it doesn't just mean that it has sex in it, or that that sex is quite explicit. It needs to be effectively more like pornography, where
Mm.
the sexual content is completely gratuitous. It's there for sort of sexual titillation and nothing else, and it has, in fact, no sort of artistic merit.
Mm.
And obviously, with gender queer, it's clearly a very well written book, and a book that a lot of people like, that has a very powerful story to tell. And so the judge in Virginia said that it absolutely is not obscene. So you can argue about age appropriateness, and clearly a book like that you probably wouldn't want very young children reading it. So you might, the in the library, it would sit in the bit of the library that's not for kids. Parents may well want to stop their kids taking it out, but you can't remove it and ban it outright, just because it doesn't fit into your worldview. It's a very slippery slope, really, because where do you draw the line?
Yeah, exactly. And now the ALA is actually under fire itself. And we've got states like Texas and Montana cutting ties with them, accusing them of pushing a political agenda. And I mean, didn't it help that the ALA's president once described herself as a Marxist lesbian? But that threw some gas on the fire for sure.
It did really. It's a bit unfortunate. I think she did delete the tweet, and it was just a single tweet, but it gave some folk a very, very convenient target. I mean, it's worth noting that being the ALA president is a generally quite a symbolic role. It's
Mm.
unpaid. It only their terms only last for a year, so her term has already ended.
Mm.
And their main job is like promoting the organization and sort of setting a bit of overall direction and so on. So it certainly doesn't reflect this very large and diverse organization.
Yeah, and the ALA is still holding firm on its stance, though, that libraries should provide materials on all viewpoints. And they say it's not about pushing a particular agenda or ideology, but about maintaining intellectual freedom, right?
Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. The only way in which the LA is radical is that they are radically non-partisan, and that they absolutely do not adhere to any particular ideology, and they work very, very hard at maintaining that stance as well. So what they do acknowledge, though, is it's very hard for libraries to walk the line between what should be included and what shouldn't. But they are trying to be neutral. They have to be
Mm-hmm.
neutral. But that's very, very difficult in this particular political climate, where if you're neutral, you're almost automatically seen to be on the other side.
Yes. Speaking of political climates, things are really heating up. And we've got Project 2025, surprise, surprise, looming on the horizon with its plans to actually classify librarians who provide inappropriate materials as sex offenders. And that's super not terrifying, right? That's just completely normal and
No,
fine.
no, just the next chapter in this dystopian novel that we're writing here.
Oh my God.
But I mean, it doesn't actually feature very strongly directly in Project 2025, but I think it's in the foreword. There's certainly like the sex offender comment, but there's not very much else about libraries or books. But generally, the thrust of sort of Project 2025 certainly mitigate against this, and in terms of the sort of the intellectual freedoms that the ALA are promoting.
Yeah, I mean, what's the bottom line here? Are libraries doomed to be battlegrounds for the foreseeable future?
I mean, honestly, yes, they probably are. As long as we're in this very polarized political moment, the battles over who controls information, especially in schools, they aren't going away. But libraries have been through worse. I mean, if they've survived banning Huckleberry Finn and the 1984 controversies back in 1984, then they can survive this too.
Well, fingers crossed. All right, folks, that's all for us today. If you haven't checked out your local library lately, maybe it's time to give a visit. Well, we still have books on the shelves, that is.
And remember, no dueling your English teachers, even if Harry Potter told you to.
Thank you so much for joining Beyond the Build Number. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have a bill or a topic you would like to see us cover, comment below. See you next time.